We'll continue our walk through the book of Job, resuming with chapter 3. This is Job's first speech, then following his loss of personal health. The short summary of chapter 3 is found there in verse 3. Let the day perish in which I was born, the night that said a man-child is conceived. What should have been an event of great joy, the birth of a child, this was so significant in the ancient culture. For if there was no child, then the parents would not be cared for. If there was no child in a family, then there was a sense of stigma for that family to remain, that couple to remain childless. And he is asking that he would never have been born. His misery is so great. On an earlier video, I suggested that when God stipulated that the adversary Satan must not extinguish Job's life, this was in effect dealing Job an additional measure of anguish rather than being a measure of mercy. And as we look towards the end here of chapter 3, we can see that Job felt similar to this sentiment. Notice, for example, verses 16 and 17 of chapter 3. Why was I not buried like a stillborn child, an infant that never sees light? And now he describes his assessment in his misery, his assessment of the condition of death. There, the wicked cease from troubling, and the weary are at rest. Those are two powerful lobes that tell us his perspective in his anguish. Number one, the bad people can't hurt me any longer. And number two, people who are hurting finally have a release from their hurt. So he would look forward to the conclusion of his earthly life. And he follows in verses 20 and following with a powerful rhetorical question. Why is light given to one that is in misery, and life to the bitter in soul? I label it rhetorical because he's not expecting an answer. I see it initially as an expression of anguish, like how terrible it is, this experience that I'm having, and particularly the fact that I still have light. That is, I still have tomorrow's sunrise. I am still existing despite my bitterness of soul. Verse 21, I am one who longs for death, but it doesn't come. So why does it not come? Now, on the other hand, perhaps we'd suggest that it's not a rhetorical question. He is actually wishing for an answer. This could be argued as well, particularly, I guess, because he's in a conversation format with his friends. Maybe we shouldn't call this a rhetorical question, but rather a genuine wrestling. In chapter 4, we initiate the responses that come from the friends. And first to speak is Eliphaz the Temanite. Keep in mind, for 7 days, Eliphaz and his two other acquaintances have waited in silence, withholding their words, and now finally, as he says in verse 2, he ventures a word. I'm intrigued by how he opens. Verse 2, if one ventures a word with you, will you be offended? This is intriguing, isn't it? He is sensitive to the anguish that his friend Job is experiencing. And he's not sure whether Job is even approachable, as if to say, maybe I should wait for another day or two or three of silence. Maybe it is still not time to speak. We must commend Eliphaz and use his model as an example thus far to consider whether or not it is yet time to speak. That is, will the person that we wish to assist be receptive? Now, as soon as we've determined it is the time to speak, then we must be very judicious in what words we say. And it will be at this point that we'll discover Eliphaz and his friends go the wrong direction. Next, notice verse 6. Eliphaz inquires, is not your fear of God? Keep in mind, once again, this is a feature of the wisdom point of view that says reverence for God is the absolute foundation. So Eliphaz notes that this is a major foundation for Job and says, look, you're there. You have fear of God. This is something you should be able to continue to count on. Don't let go of this. Won't this be the anchor of your hope Well, as the pages will continue, and as we turn the pages of this account, this isn't exactly what Job holds to, but Eliphaz is going to go a slightly different direction with it. And so notice the principle in verse 7, a foundational principle in this first answer from one of the friends. Verse 7, think now, who that was innocent ever perished, or where were the upright cut off? He is appealing to the fundamental principle of retributive justice. Retributive justice is the basic understanding of, what should we say, stability in the universe from the outlook of the wisdom school. And we say school, we're not talking about a formal collection of people, but a trend and a way of thinking, people that specialized in observing orderliness in the universe, attributing it to God, and then extrapolating from that wise courses of action in order to best assure a prosperous outcome in whatever was their future. And so here's that basic principle. Who can you think of, Job, that was innocent and yet perished? Now, he's not talking about coming to an end of life, but coming to an unjust end or an unjust experience. Were the upright cut off? And these are rhetorical questions, aren't they? Verse 8 then indicates the flip side of that, the same truth but expressed otherwise. As I have seen, incidentally, this is one of the viewpoints or one of the communication methods of the wise, the wisdom school. It's observation. Eliphaz is saying, I've looked around. I've taken inventory in what I've been aware of in my life. I have seen, and here's what I saw. People who plow iniquity, that is, plant seeds of actions that are unjust and unfair, they sow trouble, and then here's the outcome. They reap the same. This is retributive justice. Sow trouble, reap trouble. Sow evil, reap evil effects on yourself. And conversely, sow righteousness, sow faithfulness, and forth comes fair treatment from others and prosperity. Next, in the conclusion of Eliphaz's speech, we come to a very unusual element within any wisdom literature. We're still in chapter 3, beginning with verse 12. Notice what he reports. This is, again, an autobiographical report. And it occurs to me that the autobiographical report is something we find elsewhere in wisdom literature. That is to say, when Job heard Eliphaz telling about his own experience and things that he had seen, this time as in a vision, the notion of eyewitness report would have struck Job, in the wisdom way of thinking, as a valid expression. This is something to pay attention to. But what's very unusual is that it's happening in a noumenal, it's happening in a spiritual realm, a supernatural realm. Listen to this. Now a word came stealing to me. My ear received the whisper of it. Amid the thoughts from visions of the night, when deep sleep falls on mortals, dread came upon me, and trembling made all my bones shake. And now verse 15, a spirit glided past my face. The hair of my flesh bristled, stood still, but I could not discern its appearance. A form was before my eyes. Then there was silence, and I heard a voice. This is a very unusual eyewitness account for someone in the wisdom tradition to report. And with that sort of, awe-inspiring introduction, we come then to the statement that he reports hearing in verse 17, namely, can mortals be righteous before God? Restating it in good Hebrew poetic parallelism, can human beings be pure before their Maker? These were the questions that he heard this non-human voice speak to him in the dead of night. Rhetorical questions, the power of a rhetorical question is it emphasizes the obvious. What is obvious? No mortal ever can stand before God and be absolutely righteous. There's something wrong with all of us. No human can be absolutely pure when standing before the one in absolute supremacy over them, that is, their maker. Now, put this together with what Eliphaz has said earlier. Verse 8 reads, "Those who plow iniquity and sow trouble, reap the same." And now this spirit voice says, in effect, no one is without iniquity. So the implication is, Job, evidently, since none of us are without iniquity, and you are experiencing suffering, which routinely is the effect of iniquity, it must be because of this fact that we all have iniquity. So you have perhaps inadvertently, and this will be a message coming out later, you have inadvertently sinned, and that is the cause. For after all, we all sin. So your troubles, they have a logical, they trace to a logical source, and this means that conventional wisdom, retributive justice, do good, do bad, get bad, this still holds true. Eliphaz does not need to, he does not need to update his theology. His simple theology of retributive justice still holds true because he combines verse 17 with verse 9. The speech of Eliphaz, this first one, continues and concludes with chapter 5. You'll notice that NRSV has supplied the heading, "Job is corrected by God." This is a modern editor's insertion. At first read, it sounds as though God is the one speaking and issuing the correcting. That's not what this modern editor's heading actually means. For Eliphaz continues to speak, it's simply that Eliphaz is saying, Job, the correction you're experiencing is coming from God. All right, with that understanding, let's look at a couple of the highlights from Eliphaz's second chapter, here chapter 5. My attention is drawn initially, verse 1. "Call now, is there anyone who will answer you? To which of the holy ones will you turn?" This is Eliphaz's way of saying, you don't have a case, Job. You cannot appeal in the heavenlies because what you're experiencing is fair, not convenient, not pleasant, but it's fair, and refer back to the logic of Eliphaz in the previous chapter. Verse 6 I find insightful. At least it tells us what is Eliphaz's viewpoint. "For misery does not come from the earth, nor does trouble sprout from the ground." I take this to mean Eliphaz is saying, when we encounter misery, when we encounter trouble, it is not coming from a random source. Not coming from random. There's a reason behind it. Verse 7 expands and brings to full circle what was stated in verse 6. And let's examine this closely. Verse 7, "But human beings are born to trouble." The Hebrew idiom, taken at face value, which is the best way to read Hebrew, taken at face value, the idiom means human beings are born to the parentage of, if we were to take it and to paraphrase it, Mr. and Mrs. Trouble. That's what it means to be born to trouble. It doesn't mean inclined to produce trouble, but just as you would say, Jim was born to James Sr. and his wife Sally, born to. This is the idiom that's being used here. What's the implication of this concise statement? It means that human beings in their origins, that is to say the earlier history of humans, is that there is toil in their earlier history. We're not talking about the toil of childbirth. That's not the image. It means there are conditions anterior to today, preceding today. There are conditions that naturally bear fruit of difficulties or suffering. There's trouble in the background, and that's going to lead to trouble in the future. This, you see, agrees with verse 6. Verse 6 says, misery and trouble is not just random. It doesn't spring willy-nilly out of the earth, unexpected and unexplained. No. When we encounter misery, or now in verse 7, trouble, it's because there was trouble in our history. Now, the idea is not here the sins of the fathers being visited on the children in literal generation, the progress of sin. That's not the idea here. It's rather, you do wrong, you get wrong. So if I get wrong today, it's because there was trouble in my own history. There was wrongdoing in my past. So 7a is a way of expressing, once again, retributive justice. Some commentaries, if you take a look at this, will attempt to make sense of this by making recourse to revocalizing the Hebrew, so that it no longer has the meaning that humans are begotten to this the parentage of trouble. I don't feel it's necessary, and we should to revocalize the Hebrew, and we should always be very, very cautious when exercising that option. We must do our best to make sense of it as it stands, and I think it makes very good sense. Here's how it flows then, incidentally, and flows quite nicely with 7b. Once again, 7a, humans are born to trouble, that is, they grow up in a family of trouble, as it were, metaphorically, just as sparks fly upward. Now, the Hebrew expression for sparks means son of flame, and this is understood to mean a tiny flame, a spark, all right, the miniature flame. Son of flame. Do you notice how this talks about the idea of begetting? What is it that a spark is born out of, or to what parents? Well, the parents are the flames, and they, in a sense, beget little sparks that fly upward. So what we're saying is that the nature of the spark is traceable to its background, a flame. That makes sense. That's what's being said in verse 7a. The nature and experience that human beings encounter, trouble, misery, is traceable to their background or prior history. Once again, we're not talking about prior parents or what they've done. We're talking about prior history of the individual. So wrongdoing begets, that leads to misery. So verse 7, in rather, what shall we say? It's unusual language. It's not easy to read at a quick glance, but as we live with the Hebrew of this, it's a fairly powerful and concise statement underscoring retributive justice. As we continue towards the close of Eliphaz's first speech in chapter 5, let's direct our attention to verse 17. How happy is the one whom God reproves. Therefore do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. This then comprises a fundamental piece of the advice delivered by Eliphaz. Job, here's what you need to do. Instead of railing against God and wishing that you had never been born, you should recognize that when God takes the time to correct you, you are a very fortunate person. You have received an immensely valuable gift. This is the connotation of how happy is the one. So you need to not despise this discipline, don't devalue it or reject it, but realize that the misery you're experiencing is a gift from God. He's taken the time to correct you. So figure out what you've done wrong. Take advantage of this misery. Learn from the pain, and then you'll come out in a better place. He's encouraging Job to take the viewpoint that Job has done wrong and figure out what it is. This is a kernel or a summary of Eliphaz's advice.